So I want to talk about the differences between oil painting and painting with acrylics. And there's a lot of things to talk about. There's also a lot of very big misconceptions about, what are the benefits of one and what are the negatives of one. So first of all, the big difference between acrylics and oil paint is that acrylics dry very fast. So you can and you can change the drying rate of acrylic somewhat depending on whatever you mix into it. You can mix things into it that slows it down a little bit, but for the most part, acrylic paint dries very fast, like within hours of the time that you've painted it. Whereas oil paint also it depends on what medium you mix into it, so it can vary very greatly. But it usually takes at least overnight for oil paint to dry. And if it's really slow drying oil paint, it can take as long as like 2 or 3 weeks to dry if you have no dryers in it and you're using a color that's a slow drying pigment like titanium white, for instance. So that's really the big difference, is this drying rate and how that affects everything. So number one is that if you want to do any blending, for instance, if you're painting a portrait, it's really nice to be able to have wet paint that you can blend from wet paint into wet paint, and then you can come back even the next day or even 2 or 3 days later, and all that paint is wet, which gives you all these benefits of being able to blend colors into each other, to get soft blends between a transition. So there's a lot of things that you can do with wet paint that you can't do with dry paint. Now you can do all those things in acrylic, but you just have to do them quickly because your paint's going to start drying within hours. And so that massively will affect the whole process of painting. It's just that drying rate. The other thing is acrylic paint, you can have water cleanup, which is something everybody loves, because you just go, you buy some acrylic paint, you squirt it out of the tube. It's pretty much ready to use out of the tube, and you can paint with it, and then you can go get a glass of water and clean your brushes with the water. And that's really nice. There's no toxicity. There's no, it's real simple. You don't have to buy solvents and get into all the complexity of dealing with oil paint. And that brings me to the point, a really important point that I want to make, and that is oil painting does not have to be toxic. You don't have to use mineral spirits. You can just thin your oil paint down with linseed oil, which is completely non-toxic. So therefore, you don't have to use solvents when you paint. You're still going to have the slow drying aspect of oil painting, but you don't have to bring in the toxic solvents and everything else. Unlike acrylic paint, when you buy normal oil paint, it's very stiff when it comes out of the tube, and you have to thin it down and make it a little more fluid so that it's easier to brush on the canvas. Whereas acrylic paint already has the right amount of basically water in it to keep that consistency, so it's ready to use right out of the tube. Now, the Geneva paint that we make has the medium already mixed into it, so you can just squirt it out and use it. But even if you're using any major manufacturer's paint, you can just have some linseed oil and just thin it down with the linseed oil. So now you have no toxic fumes. There are some exceptions, like Griffin oil paint by Winsor Newton, which is a very fast drying oil paint, but is also very toxic to breathe, and you have to have very good adequate ventilation if you're going to use the Griffin paints. But those are very unique modern paints that have very toxic smelling dryers in the paint, mixed into the paint. But most oil paint, almost all oil paint that you buy, is non-toxic to breathe. And if you're using non-toxic pigments, it's completely non-toxic, even if you get it on your hands or accidentally consume some of it. The medium that you use to thin those oil paints down often will have smelly toxic fumes, like for instance Liquid by Winsor Newton. And a lot of these mediums that they sell actually have fumes, and you need to use adequate ventilation. But again, you don't have to use those mediums with modern paints. You can just thin your paint down with just linseed oil. A lot of people use walnut oil, and they think there's some benefit to that, but I recommend just refined linseed oil because it will create the strongest paint films, and it's it's the best for quality of the paint over the long term. Okay, so let's get back to this real big difference. You have fast drying and you have slow drying. And there's benefits to each. Now, if you're a starting artist and you just want to like, paint, just on a sort of, on the weekends a little bit, and you don't want to take this whole thing very seriously, then, by all means, just go buy your acrylic paint and just have fun. But in terms of painting realism, high realism, oil painting has all these benefits. Number one is right off the bat, it dries slow. So that's going to allow you time to, blend colors, to work colors into each other. It's not going to, like if you're trying to paint an egg or a smooth vase, and your paint is dry, you're not going to be able to get that smooth transition that you can get working in, wet and wet. And I don't even paint smooth. I like to leave a little texture on the surface, but still trying to work with acrylic, it just dries so fast that you're not going to get those nice qualities that you get when you're working wet and wet, which is a wonderful way to create real high realism. So that's the first thing, is that the oil paint drying slow is actually a huge benefit. You can also mix up a palette of color and then come back, 2, 3, 4, even a week later, and those colors can still be wet if you're using slow dry oil paint. Now there's some oil paint and oil colors that do dry fast, like burnt umber and some others that dry faster than the other, but you can always even slow your drying rate down by adding a little oil of cloves or whatever. So all this gets real complicated, or seems to be complicated, as we start talking about how am I going to thin down my oil paint and everything else. But if you just take these colors that I recommend here, and these are the colors that are available all over the world, and then I've also, these are the Geneva colors, which are the corresponding pigments. But these 5 colors are the only colors you need to mix almost every color in the world, with the exception of super bright pop colors. But you can mix all the colors with these simple 5 colors, and all you need to do is buy those 5 colors and then thin them down with a little bit of refined linseed oil, and you're ready to go. That's all you need to do. So you can have all those benefits and no toxic fumes if you're mixing your paint like that. Now when it comes to brush care and taking care of your brushes after you finish painting for the day or whatever, you will need to find a way to keep those brushes from drying. Now you've got a lot of time. The oil paint might take 2 or 3 days to dry, but when you're not painting, you will need to either submerge the ends of your brushes in some refined linseed oil or whatever it is, but you'll have to find a solution to keep your brushes from drying out. And of course, Geneva Fine Art, we make brush dip, but you can make your own brush dip using this recipe here on the screen. And if you just take your dry brushes at the end of your session and dip them in some of this brush dip, they'll stay wet for like 2 weeks, and then you can just re-dip them that way. And that way you're not spending a whole bunch of time cleaning brushes when you're oil painting. Now, one of the negatives about having a really fast dry paint like acrylic is that you have to worry about ruining your brushes all the time. Because if you let that acrylic paint dry in your brushes, they'll be ruined. So that's something that you're always going to have to really be careful of. Whereas if you're using oil paint, it's far less of an issue because the paint stays wet for so long that you can have time to like get those brushes cleaned or dipped in brush dip or whatever you have to do. Now there's one other big difference between oil paints and acrylic, and that is that your blackest blacks in oil paint can be slightly darker than your blackest blacks in acrylic. And that's because all acrylic paint is made with a base that's got a little bit of white in it, even though it might be like a transparent. But it's so they can put all that black pigment in there, but it's never going to be as black as the oil painting black. So you have a little bit more range of values to a darker dark with oil paint than you do with acrylic. Also, some of the colors can be richer for that same reason. For instance, if you want to mix a really deep blood red, like with an alizarin crimson or a permanent alizarin crimson, that color is going to be slightly darker and slightly richer in the oil paint. So you've got slightly richer colors, slightly more dynamic range, and so that's a benefit of oil paint. But if you want to achieve really high realism, like it can be done with acrylic paints, but it's just more difficult. If you told me to try to paint a portrait with acrylics, oh man, it would just be, it would be so much more difficult to paint super high realism with acrylic, just because that paint's drying so fast all the time. But for the most part, oil paint is the better medium in terms of ability to paint what you see, plain as that. And then acrylics are just more convenient. That's kind of the basic difference between the two. But oil paint doesn't have to be toxic. You just can use linseed oil as your medium, and then there's no toxic fumes and no toxicity that you have to worry about. You wouldn't want to use like flake white, which has lead white in it, which is toxic, and any of the other toxic pigments that are out there. There's a few of them, but for the most part, all the oil colors and pigments are non-toxic. It's only when you put that solvent in there that it can start to be smelly and be toxic. Like liquid, for instance, is very smelly, and you don't want to be using that without good, adequate ventilation. So use linseed oil instead. Well, thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in taking a private class from me, either online or in person, email me at mark@drawmixedpaint.com, and I'll give you more information about my private classes. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.